sign of how extraordinary an inflection point traditional energy sources are at is, I think, contained in this picture. It's a graphic of various commodity prices for the last 30 years or so. Oil and gas in there, but also we've mixed in there as well some other commodities, iron ore, copper, just to give you a flavor that this is a systemic issue. For many years, the price of oil was $20 or $25. That was the way the world was. It worked for OPEC, worked for consumers. And for many years, OPEC managed and was able to manage pricing through, in a very, very narrow window. Actually, $18 to $25 for much of the 90s was the target zone. Early 2000s was the target zone. But then, in the early 2000s, something happened. As you can see from this picture, it's something quite extraordinary. Prices structurally broke out from traditional trading zones to levels that were unimaginable. I was working in the Middle East in the late 90s, and the oil price hit $9 per barrel. We were banned from buying office furniture. We were encouraged to share taxis to airports for changes, crew changes from the desert. I mean, this was a business which was, in some ways you would say, like any other. It was cost conscious and had to make tough business decisions. Well, for much of the last 10 years, that hasn't really been the case. We've seen astonishing breakouts from established trading zones for all of these commodities, driven by a combination, I think, of globalization, of stress in the demand chains, but more importantly, simply extraction costs are becoming dramatically greater. The cost of the marginal barrel of oil is enormously greater than it was 10 years ago. We've moved into deep water. We're considering moving towards the Arctic. So some of this was portrayed as being market effects. Actually, this, I would challenge, is very, very real, which makes it an interesting environment to be having conversations around alternatives to these, because these changes in these price levels, which start to advantage alternatives, are not temporary. I will assert that they are structural. So that's traditional sources, but what about renewables? Huge issue for Denmark, and an area where Denmark has really been one of the national pioneers, along with, for example, in Europe, probably Spain has been one of the other real pioneering, committed parties to the aggressive development of renewables. This is a picture, and actually it's a very picture of some very, very complex economics behind it and some judgment calls behind it. So these are not absolute numbers, but I think they give you a good flavor of the levelized cost of electricity in cents per kilowatt hour of a variety of competing electricity supply sources. Now, in there you have to take a viewpoint on financing costs, on operations and maintenance costs of new investments, of carbon costs, but all in, these are probably a healthy indicative number. And what you can see is that on the left-hand side, traditional sources are all now well within and tend to dictate the price band for electricity on wholesale. You can also see with the red arrows that those prices are likely to be only going up in the years ahead, driven by aging infrastructure, increased maintenance costs, and increased costs of feedstock. On the right-hand side, you see a variety of renewables currently in the mix. You see that some of them are absolutely cost competitive at current levels. You see that some of them are absolutely not cost competitive at current levels. You see that virtually all of them are heading downhill at a variety of different paces. And as you think about the case today, these are going to be crucial questions. Questions around, well, how far can we go? How far can this source realistically become competitive with its competitors? How fast? And what will it take to get there? What's it taking to drive that down? Because many of these sources depend upon technology change. They depend upon increased scale, manufacturing scale to bring down costs. They depend upon experience, in terms of experience emerging as operators, and in terms of operating these plants at scale efficiently. In the late 1960s, Bruce Henderson, who you saw earlier, developed the concept of the experience curve, not the scale curve, but the experience curve, which combines, it's not an academic viewpoint, it's simply an observation that with cumulative experience, unit costs of anything tend to go down. And the steepness of that curve varies by industry. So he started by looking at semiconductors. Actually, you can look at it, look at many, many other things. And the experience curve for these technologies will be key in terms of shaping their evolution in the years ahead. And alongside that renewables competitiveness issue is, of course, the issue of carbon. And the issue of carbon may be something that you'll be exploring in the day ahead. What's for sure is that if we continue on a current path of hydrocarbon-dependent growth, our annual CO2 emissions will double. And that's going to lead to a 25% increase in atmospheric carbon concentration. Now, how can we stabilize that? Well, the scale of response would have to be enormous. And I think, certainly before I started to look at sustainability and renewables with any seriousness, it's hard to get your arms around just the scale of response that's necessary to have a meaningful effect in terms of sustainability. So these are some pictures which, this is a framework that Princeton has developed around how to think about slices of carbon reduction to stabilize at current levels. They give a flavor of one slice of carbon reduction as being 3 to 4 gigaton reduction. And let's pick out a couple of those. On what, in practical terms, would it take to have a meaningful difference to carbon emissions? Doubling the fuel efficiency of every car on the planet. Switching 1,400 coal-fired power plants, of which China is building, I think it was one every 2 weeks, to gas. Multiplying global wind capacity by 25 worldwide. So, thinking of any sustainability or carbon reduction issues in the day ahead, remember, to have any materiality on a national or global scale, you need to be thinking at serious scale. Offshore wind is a fascinating example of a technology that really does have that massive applicability. My green energy colleagues in the UK a couple of years ago did a great piece of work for the Office of Her Majesty the Queen, who very fortunately for her owns all of the UK's non-mineral offshore resources. Essentially, she owns all of the near coast. And the question was, what, in terms of wind energy, what could this be worth? And what it was found using very, very reasonable assumptions was that using current technology, if fully exploited, the UK could be absolutely self-sufficient in energy, absolutely get rid of the North Sea oil industry. It could be self-sufficient in wind energy and also become a significant exporter of wind energy to Europe with the right infrastructure. That's a technology that, if you decide to get serious about it, and you can overcome the barrier, that has some materiality to it. Too many renewable technologies are interesting science projects. In the next 32 hours, ask some difficult questions. So that's the backdrop, the energy landscape. To me, it's just a fascinating general interest area, but we need to get serious and talk about how to make money and business models in this area. As we go through these few pages, start to embed a few concepts in your mind. Start to embed concepts of why this industry is perhaps different from many that you deal with in your day-to-day lives or in in other case studies. Start to get a flavor that this is actually a series of complex and overlapping value chains where the capabilities for success and the nature of the business at each step is very, very different. You have some elements of this business that are very big bet, high reward businesses, like deep water or oil exploration. You have some businesses that are classic operational excellence, pricing, customer-facing businesses, like domestic gas supply. And you have a whole lot of very, very interesting businesses in between. So why is energy perhaps different from many industries that you may face? And what do all areas have in common? Well, firstly, they are almost exclusively capital intensive, very capital intensive. A large offshore oil and gas project used to be $1 billion. These days, Try 20 billion. A deep water drilling rig, like the Deepwater Horizon that sank 2 years ago, somewhere between $500 and $750 million at the top. That was the insurance value of the Deepwater Horizon. You need to take a very, very long-term perspective. Long-term means 20 to 30 years. Why? Because typically the assets you're dealing with have asset lives of that kind of length. Typically, in many of these businesses, because of the capital intensity, you're going to need to be around for that long to make any money. When you're dealing with very, very long-term businesses, a number of things which are apparently small start to make a very, very big difference. Financing, regulation, the progression and evolution of alternatives, political considerations, how society may change its views about what you're doing. War. So you're going to have to build in longer-term uncertainties and take a view on them than you would do in a consumer-facing or retail business. Thirdly, close to governments, I would expand this to say that almost every aspect of the energy industry is shaped enormously by the regulatory and political environment in which it exists. Green energy, for example, through the mid-2000s in the US enjoyed around $26 billion of state subsidies. Conversely, 3 weeks ago in Spain removed all subsidy for new renewables projects. Your relationship with the government can change that fast, and that can sometimes be the make or break for your business. Incidentally, whilst in the US, green energy enjoyed $26 billion of subsidies through the mid-2000s, the oil and gas industry enjoyed $76 billion. So you still see where George Bush's love lies. Thirdly, it's critical for economic security. It's not an optional product. Most countries have chosen to outsource provision of this economic security to private organizations. And actually many, particularly the large resource holders, haven't. But it's a deeply strategic subject and is intertwined with geopolitics, particularly once you start to get into international relationships around energy. Historically, over the last 2 or 3 years, that has spawned a lot of talk that domestic sources of supply are fundamentally advantaged. What we've tended to see is that domestic sources of supply in many countries are nice to have, but people aren't willing to pay more for them. So whilst it's a useful extra, it's not going to be a deal breaker, and consumers are not willing to pay significantly extra simply because it's a homegrown supply. Finally, prices are very, very sensitive to political events, and that can both work in your favor. For example, oil closed at $122 per barrel yesterday. You start to run many renewable energy economics at those numbers, they start to look very, very good. But also sudden stabilization and good things. If Iraq stabilized quickly, I'm not holding my breath, there's a reasonable expectation that 3 or 4 million barrels of crude could come to market in the next 3 to 5 years. Well, that suddenly starts to triple the world's spare capacity of oil with an impact on oil price, and a very sudden impact on competing technologies. So start to think big, start to think long term, and start to think that the little things matter. This is a real black swan type industry, as well as being one that in the long term, as well as being one that you have to deal with many more familiar business issues in the short term. We took a look at the value chain in an earlier page, but let's take a look at how companies choose to play in this area. There are 3 elements to the value chain here. We talked upstream, we talked midstream, conversion, generation, transportation, and we talked downstream, facing the customer. Now, I think it would be helpful for you to start embedding this idea in your head, that upstream is resource-led. I'm led by the resource, my business is led by the resource, my competitive advantage is access to the resource, understanding it, and being able to develop projects that exploit it. Midstream is an asset business. So like all asset businesses, it's about structuring a capital investment right. It's around getting the right financing conditions. It's around getting the right pricing conditions and off-take agreements for your supply. And it's about making the right big bet, the right technology, the right asset in the right place. You've made a big bet on coal-fired power stations in Europe for the next 30 years. You really better worry about carbon pricing. And finally, marketing and sales are market-led activities. To excel in these, you need to understand being close to the customer. You need to understand very high-speed dynamic pricing. You need to understand marketing, sales, customer access, customer churn, customer management. It's about operational excellence of call centers. It's around things that, at the right-hand side of this page, tend to have a lot more in common with many, many other business areas, the classic B2B, and sometimes B2C consumer areas. So start to think market-led, asset-led, and resource-led would be a helpful mental model. Within this model, you tend to have a number of different business models. And again, I would encourage you to start to ask questions around the business models that you're facing. Are you a developer? Are you uniquely good at harnessing the resource, accessing the resource, and orchestrating a project to exploit it? A good and great example, Shell, my former company. Shell's internal technical capability is actually, you would be surprised, surprisingly low. They have incredible orchestration capability, the ability to be a smart and informed buyer of what the market provides. Shell employs very, very few real engineers, certainly not doing engineering. There is the technology or asset provider. Pieces of Maersk are a great example of this. Maersk Drilling, operating large drilling rigs, also large floating production and storage assets. Major heavy asset businesses about making the right asset bets, about managing utilization and managing ops and maintenance costs. Am I a technology or an asset provider? Am I an asset operator? Is my advantage that I can squeeze value from the asset that the developer has put in place by operating it excellently, more flexibly, or more efficiently than my competition? Or potentially, am I an investor? Well, I leave it to others, but is my competitive advantage the ability to place the right bets and take the right blend of portfolio viewpoints with which to create value? Pick out a few. E.ON, for example, would say that its core competence is actually probably slightly further to the left here. E.ON is a big fleet of power generation of various types. It also makes selective bets in the upstream to secure resource to supply those plants, and act as a little bit of a hedge against supply cost inflation. It also has significant customer-facing business, but its real heart is a big project developer and asset operator. BHP Billiton, as a miner, is that, and relatively speaking, only that. Major developer, big projects, and offload the product as soon as you can. Some trading activity around it, but know what you're good at and have a very, very clear of which piece of the value chain you're operating in. It's going to be absolutely crucial, because other than the very, very largest firms here, what you can see is that very few firms do everything. Also, there are no fixed business models here. Firms can choose to play in a couple of areas, not in others. There's a lot of opportunity for business model innovation here. But I would challenge you to have a very strong view of why you are a good developer, why you have a strong technology understanding, or how a marketing business and why a marketing business should live alongside a technology business. And the final point I would like to leave you with is that we saw traditional energy supplies, while still absolutely dominant. In 2030, 85% of our world will still be hydrocarbon fueled. A strong case is emerging to consider very, very seriously alternatives at scale. But what you tend to find is that to progress against the advantage of the incumbents is a challenging task, because they have what in industrial speak is known as, well, achieving displacement economics. Very, very difficult, because incumbent suppliers tend to be advantaged both because they already have a lot of sunk costs in their assets, a lot of the user base is already oriented towards using their product. A great example is gasoline in our cars. Very, very hard for alternatives like electric cars to penetrate, not only because of economics or technology, but also because of the infrastructure that we have built to support one source doesn't easily transfer to another. There's a lot of momentum in energy applied at scale. So to commercialize a new technology, you're going to have to be very, very smart and manage your risks, manage your investment along the way. The path of progression tends to be fairly predictable, and looking as an analog at wind, for example, is a nice example of how to develop and scale up these business models to commerciality. Firstly, there's the issue of feasibility. Well, could it work? There's the issue of selecting my concept, because very often for a lot of new technologies there are a number of competing concepts, and very rarely do they all win out in the end. Once you've selected your concept, you make a big decision around that's what I'm going to go for at scale. Then start to build pilot plans, proofs of concept, and they need to start becoming or getting close to serious economics then. And then finally, full-size plants, scaling up the solution, becoming genuinely competitive. In the early phases, those energies, particularly renewables, have historically in recent years been very, very dependent on various forms of subsidy, either grants, either feed-in tariffs. But in the current environment, those are pretty hard to come by, and they're quite fragile. So how do I scale up a renewable resource when the supportiveness of the external environment to fund it for me has become far weaker than it was? Once you've proved up the technology at a full-scale plant, transition to full-scale operation. This is a capital project business, securing sites, developing them, operating them, and managing them. The question for many technology developers is, could I and should I take the step from being the technology developer and the concept prover to being the owner and operator? What's the right role for me to play? Am I a licensee? Do I want to grow my business with the technology, or is someone else fundamentally advantaged? Either way, as you go through this journey, you'll be facing, as I emphasized at the start, this playground of every aspect of business that you could possibly imagine. So again, technology, markets, competitors, ethics, sustainability. And with that in mind, I'd just like to give you some small words of coaching around how you think about the case in the day ahead. In the States, there's a familiar term which is motherhood and apple pie, which business consultants usually hear from cynical clients around some advice you've just given them, but essentially it means what you've just told me is relatively obvious and doesn't give me anything specific that I can act on. But these are the points that we ourselves take into our work, and I think it's a healthy point for you to stick on the wall and just challenge your thinking once in a while. Firstly, understand the full picture, but a business of this scale and complexity is going to be too big to digest in one mouthful. Decide what matters and focus on that piece of it rigorously. Don't try to eat the elephant. Reduce complexity, don't increase it. It's when young associates start to work with BCG, one of the worst headlines they can possibly put on the slide is, the energy industry has a complex value chain. Well, thank you very much. That was good advice. That really helped me. A slide headline that's much more helpful is, within the energy industry, two things matter: site access and capital project excellence. That then starts to move you towards a solution. So think about what matters. Break the project into chunks within your team. Think about how you're going to divide the work between you, because that's the key. Now, once again, that's exactly what we do in our project work. Identify what matters, slice it into modules, and drive them relatively independently with regular checkpoints to review what one another's findings mean for one another. Qualify it and quantify it. I emphasize throughout that material that this is a business of long-term and massive uncertainty. But that answer isn't good enough. How big's the uncertainty? Well, the market could range from 1 billion to 3 billion is a lot more helpful to me than the future market outlook is uncertain. Okay, so quantify where possible. Uncertainty is fine. And to be honest, uncertainty, if you don't present uncertainties, I will be cynical about your response because there is so much uncertainty embedded in this long-term business. Finally, bring some value to the table. This is, once again, as a commercial business consultant, something that you have to continually draw yourself back to is many of the industries and issues that we get to work on are intellectually simply fascinating. It's just interesting stuff to think about. But what does it mean? So what? How do I make money? What do you actually want me to do? And what are the risks associated with it? How have you helped me in your work? Not just how have you explored the issue. I guess with that clear and specific advice, you're probably well placed to solve the case this morning. So I hope that whilst the energy industry is too big to even scratch the surface of in a short session, I hope I've given you a flavour of some of the issues. I hope I've given you a flavour of certainly the enthusiasm that I have for it. A flavour of the fact that it's a great place to apply the massive business expertise represented in the room today. And good luck. Enjoy yourselves.
Thank you very much, Philip Whittaker in the London office, and thank you very much for BCG, our third consulting partner at CBS Case Competition, for arranging this today. Hopefully you don't hate us yet. We could have chosen an easy issue for you, but I'm sure you will like the challenge as much as we have. We will now present the case company in 2012, as always, in a case video. So, just...
Nature is perfect the way it is, and we want to keep it that way. But the world we share is developing at a pace never seen before. As the population grows, so does demand for energy and resources. Resources we need to preserve for our world to keep developing. Therefore, we're faced with some huge challenges. We need to produce enough energy to meet rising demand. And we need to cut CO2 emissions from our production and consumption of energy. Until now, a global climate agreement has proven elusive, as talk has got in the way of action. It has been up to individuals, organizations, and companies to change perspectives and help us move forward together. It is therefore with great pleasure that the CBS Case Competition presents the Case Company of 2012, Dawn Energy. Dawn Energy is one of Northern Europe's leading energy groups with a vision to provide clean and reliable energy.
Dawn Energy used to be a traditional utility, with all that means. But we decided after the experiences in COP15 in 2009 that even though the politicians were not able to deliver a framework for changing the world, then we had to push and try to make this happen anyhow. And therefore we decided in this company that we would not slow down, but rather speed up and make this change happen fast. And we are well on our way to do that already, converting from the black economy and the black way of doing energy to the green way of doing it. And we're very proud to be some of the frontrunners, maybe the frontrunner, doing this. We know there are risks in it, but there are also great opportunities, and we hope that we do it the right way. And with your help, I'm quite confident that we will make that.
Dawn Energy is leading the development and construction of offshore wind farms, with a renewable energy capacity target of at least 3,000 megawatts by 2020. Rebuilding many of its power stations to increase the use of biomass and natural gas in heat and power generation. Working towards increased flexibility, ensuring a continuous balance between demand and supply, partnering industry to cut energy consumption and reduce CO2 emissions. Developing technologies that enable a more intelligent use of biomass. Inventing new ways to recycle waste more efficiently and generate more energy for tomorrow.
There are many challenges in the energy sector, and of course, when we change things, opportunities arise, but also risks that you do it in the wrong way, and therefore that you lose your foothold arise. So we have to do it, but we have to do it carefully so that we can manage the company, we can make money, we can be sure that technologies and new technologies we are implementing are effective and that they work, and that the consumers like what we do and accept the changes we propose to them. So it's not an easy ride, but it's doable.
In this specific case, we will ask you to provide us with your ideas and create business solutions for how Dong Energy should move energy forward.
We decided to participate in this competition because we simply can learn a lot from the young people. So we are very, very interested to hear all the good ideas from next generation. My advice to you in this competition will be to be open-minded, not to think of business as usual, not to think of what is not possible, but to try to see the opportunities, the possibilities. And therefore, I wish all of you hard work, days and nights with hard work, and good luck. And I look very much forward to see and listen to the results when we meet on Friday.
Now we will see what the best talent from 12 universities from all over the world can do. We're looking forward to seeing how you will solve this great challenge.
For 8 months, we've been preparing the presentation of our next speaker. And I'm going to keep it very simple because I'm looking very much forward to actually using these next few words. So please welcome to the stage Jakob, Asgaard, Chris,
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for welcoming the case of the CBS case competition 2012. It is definitely going to be an exciting 32 hours you have in front of you. And just to put Dong Energy into a little bit of a perspective, you will obviously get a lot more information and you will get the chance to read the case. We see ourselves as one of the leading energy companies. Well, in fact, that doesn't say much because, as Philip said, there are very big companies in this industry, global companies, much bigger than Dong Energy. In fact, we are kind of a small company compared to some of the global clients that employees. CEO about 7.3 billion euros. So it's not as big as Shell or these other companies. Sorry? Yes, I'll try. We are, as a company, as was also illustrated on the slide previously, we are present in the entire value chain of energy. We are active in oil and gas, exploration and production. Maybe that will help. We are active operating a fleet of power plants. We are the world leader in developing offshore wind farms. We do energy trading on the European energy trading exchanges, and we are active in sales and distribution in the whole downstream piece of the business. We are supplying all of Greater Copenhagen with power. So the power supply that you are receiving here in this room comes from our company.
I think what makes this company interesting, as was also alluded to in the video, is that over the past 4 or 5 years, we have really taken a dramatic decision to change the company. Going back 4 or 5 years, we were among the most coal-intensive power generators in Europe. We had statistics on that, and we could see that we were quite exposed to the whole world of climate change, the whole debate and the whole increasing cost of CO2 pollution. So we basically decided to change our business from being very coal-intensive in our power and heat production into being a green energy company, building out massively offshore wind and converting or closing down a large part of our thermal capacity. So already today we have achieved great progress in this area, but there's much more to come. We basically by 2020 we want to be 50-50% green and black, whereas in 2006 we were 85% black and 15% green. So we are moving forward quite fast. Just these days we are adding up the numbers for 2011, and we can see that we are ahead of the schedule. So we'll probably, if we continue at this pace, arrive at the 50-50 before 2020. Our ultimate goal is in 2040 to have 85% green and 15% black. So we basically changed that proportion over the lifetime of a generation. I think what is also interesting, a lot of you have traveled to Denmark, that this transformation actually takes place in Denmark. The Danish government has said that in 2050, Denmark is going to be independent of fossil fuels. So Denmark actually has the most ambitious strategy in the world to decarbonize its energy system. And within that most ambitious country strategy of any country that we know of at least, we have this company, which is by a number of standards probably one of the fastest changing companies in terms of going from the old way of doing things to the new way of doing things. So this basically sets the framework of what you'll be doing over the next 32 hours. Where should we take this company going forward? With all the opportunities that you'll read about in the case, with all the technologies we employ and work with, what should we do? What is the best way forward if we want to lead this green transformation? I think that Philip provided a great overview of the industry. It is quite a complex industry. There's a lot of things to get lost in, so to speak. And that is why I think that you should listen very carefully to the advice he gave on trying to understand the big picture, but also to focus and try not to increase complexity, but to reduce it. And try to use your business skills, both qualitatively and quantitatively, to apply an analytical perspective of what we're talking about here. You need to be specific, use examples, bring in experience from your home countries, all kinds of things that can sort of add some richness and reduce the complexity of this case. And then first and foremost, as our CEO also said, be actionable. Come up with some specific recommendations on what we should do. That is what we really are looking forward to hearing on Friday. So I think with these words, I'll leave it to you guys to do the hard work. Good luck. We'll see each other on Friday, and we are very much looking forward to hearing your perspectives on the case. Thanks a lot.
Normally, this is where the case launch ends. We do have one more slide, because we had advice from BCG saying you cannot put these guys through this without giving them more advice. It's simply too complex. They'll get lost in it. So we've given you some pointers to take home, or to take to your group room for. The first one I'm going to say is, Last year, our chairman of the jury, Oscar Moskov, some of you may know the name, said the apparel industry was the perfect industry for a case company because it reduced the complexity in the case in such a large degree that the presentations simply raised in quality, and it was a great show for the final. That's one way of looking at it. We respectfully disagree. We believe that by increasing complexity, by making the case so complex, the worst case probability, the CBS case competition, in those terms so far. Okay? As Philip mentioned, do not eat the entire elephant at once, take a bite. You will not only be presented with one elephant, but 10 elephants. So the first you do is pick out which elephants you will be born on, and then take a bite. Okay? So we cannot stress how much that the case is meant to be complex. Yes, your presentations are not necessarily meant to be complex. You are not technical experts, you are business leaders, you are very well aware. But the case may very well be presented with technical solutions as well. We expect business solutions. Maybe this, if you can talk about the data part.
We're entering an era of big data. CBS case competition has to be a front runner. So we give you lots of data. And with lots of data comes lots of useful insights. But you must realize that the best insight comes not from using all of the data and compiling it into one big graph. You must pick out the data that is relevant for your solution and fits into your strategy. And use that data to support your case solution.
The final point, you'll probably, even after 31 and a half hours, still think you could have done something entirely different. And yes, you could. There is no one optimal solution for this case. So there's a wide solution space, but your job is not to cover the wide solution space. Your job is simply to pick and focus. And the judge should be given that information so that you've been asked to pick and focus and go into depth and actually come up with analytical things. Okay? So with that, we will welcome for the first time as well in CBS Case Competition the 12 team hosts to the stage in order to receive the case and the information on a USB key for their team. So please, 12 team hosts, approach. Final words will be good luck. And this off the camera. Please, only the CBS case competition team, you need to Thank you.